In the afternoon of November the 24th, 1971, a middle-aged man carrying a briefcase walked into Portland
Bunun boyutunu ayarlayamıyoruz mu ya?
International Airport and purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington. The man identified himself as Dan Cooper and along with 36 other passengers.
Bu adam kim? DB Cooper kim arkadaşlar? Önce bir ön bilgi alalım, yine öyle izleyelim. DB Cooper kim? Bir dünya parayla kaçan ama yakalanmayan adam, yakın tarihte bunun çaldığı paralardan bir kısmına ulaşılmış. Hırsız. Dan Cooper 1971 tarihinde öğleden sonra Portland ve Seattle arasındaki Amerika Birleşik Devletleri hava sahasında yer alan Boeing mi kaçırıyor? Dur izleyelim.
A crew of 6, he soon boarded Northwest Airlines Flight 305. Once aboard, Cooper made himself comfortable in the middle of the last row of seats on the right side of the cabin. He ordered a drink and had a smoke because this was the 70s.
Eskiden bir de muhabbet vardı ha. Herkes uçakta, otobüste patır patır sigara içiyormuş.
Once the flight was cleared for departure, Cooper turned around and handed an envelope to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. Inside the envelope was a note featuring a handwritten message stating he had a bomb. Schaffner reluctantly sat down beside him and glimpsed what...
Oh siktir. Altıma sıçarım. Düşünsene, orada çalışıyorsa adam sana kağıt veriyor, diyor ki bende bomba var, sesini soluğunu çıkartma, yanıma otur.
Appeared to be 8 sticks of dynamite inside his briefcase. Cooper's demands were quite simple. He wanted $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. He
Nasıl yapacağım bunu?
also demanded a fuel truck to stand ready to refuel the aircraft once they landed in Seattle.
Adamda bir de yetenek de var, uçurup götürecek ha?
Should they fail to comply with his demands, he threatened to, quote, do the job. Once the flight was airborne, Schaffner went to inform the cockpit crew, while another flight attendant by the name of Tina Mucklow remained by Cooper's side. By using a telephone in the rear of the cabin, Mucklow acted as an intermediary between Cooper and the rest of the flight crew for the remainder of the hijacking.
Oğlum çok korkunç.
For the next hour and a half, Flight 305 maintained a holding pattern near Seattle, while local and federal authorities scrambled to procure the ransom as well as the 4 parachutes. 10,000 $20 bills were collected from a local bank, while the owner of a nearby skydiving school supplied the chutes.
Hemen hallediyorlar ha. Tabii oğlum, çok büyük olay değil mi?
At 5:45 p.m., more than 2 hours past its scheduled arrival, Flight 305 finally touched down in Seattle. By this point, it was well after sunset, and the aircraft was brought to a remote section of the tarmac.
Ama bu adam kimseyi indirttirmez bu uçaktan. Der ki indirirken kapatın tüm camları. Kapat! Tüm camlar kapatılacak. Hiç kimse dışarıya bile çıkamaz. Çıktığınız an bombayı patlatırım. Anladın mı? O uçaktan kimse inemez.
Once the flight came to a stop, both the ransom and the parachutes were handed over to Mucklow, who then brought them back aboard. In exchange, Cooper permitted 2 of the flight attendants as well as all the passengers to disembark.
Vermiş la.
Many of whom had not yet realized the flight had been hijacked.
Hiç haberleri yok.
With the ransom paid and only 4 crew members remaining on board, Cooper told Mucklow to inform the captain that he wanted to fly to Mexico City.
Kaptanla gidiyor. Kaptan diyordur, ulan mesleğimi de, yapacağım işi de. Ulan binmez olaydım.
They were to fly with the landing gear down, the flaps at 15 degrees and below 10,000 feet. The lights in the cabin were to be switched off, and the aft stairway, which opens from the underbelly of the fuselage, was to remain extended.
Deli lan bu.
2 of Cooper's demands could not be satisfied. First of all, the flight configuration he'd requested would not allow for a non-stop flight to Mexico City. As such, Cooper proposed a refueling stop in Phoenix, Yuma, or Sacramento before they all agreed on Reno, Nevada. Second of all, it was not possible to depart with the ventral staircase extended. Cooper agreed to retract the stairs on the condition that Mucklow remained by his side and taught him how to extend them once the plane was airborne. Parked for nearly 2 hours due to complications with refueling.
Pilot da anlatır oğlum, niye anlatmasın ki? Der ki siktirsin gitsin, atlıyorsa atlasın, açarım ben onu.
Flight 305 was back in the air by 7:36 p.m. Less than 5 minutes after takeoff, Cooper told Mucklow to head for the cockpit and that from this point onwards he was not to be disturbed. The last time she saw Cooper, he was standing in the middle of the aisle as if though he was preparing to jump.
Atlayacak, orada hesaplamış zaten oğlum. 10.000 feet olacak, şöyle gideceğiz.
Mucklow
Fazla hızlanmasın.
joined the rest of the crew, locked the cockpit door behind her, and some 3 hours later, Flight 305 safely landed in Reno. Once the flight came to a stop, the crew carefully ventured into the rear of the cabin, but there was no sign of Cooper nor the bomb.
Adam gitmiş.
The aft stairway had been extended mid-flight and was slightly damaged upon landing. It seemed there was only one explanation for the hijacker's absence.
Paraşütle atlamış ha. Niye 4 tane acaba?
At some point between Seattle and Reno, Cooper had strapped on a parachute, walked down the stairs, and leaped into the dark of night.
4 tane istemesinin sebebi, ben size bir şey diyeyim mi? Bak, fake paraşüt vermesinler. Hani burada olan kişilere de takıp onları da atlatabilirim. Hani sahte gelmesin anlamında bence öyle istemiş. Sanki hani başka insanları atlatabilirim anlamında. Hani sahte verirlerse onlar yüzünden başka insanlar ölmesin diye. O yüzden 4 tane istemiş. Yama bak la, atlamış ha. Şimdi hemen burada FBI adamın karakter analizini yapıyordur. Bu adam paraşüt atlamayı biliyorsa, aksiyon sporlarıyla ilgileniyor. Uçuşun o seviyelerini falan biliyorsa bu tarz şeylere hakim, eski bir asker olabilir, bir şey olabilir. İnsan avı mı başlıyor? Milleti mi kesecek?
As soon as it became clear that Cooper was no longer on board, dozens of FBI agents converged upon the aircraft, only to discover a disappointing amount of physical evidence. A black clip-on tie, 8 cigarette butts,
Çakala bak, 8 tane sigara içmiş.
and 2 of the 4 parachutes were all that Cooper left behind.
2 tane bırakmış, 2 tane almış yanına. Demek ki bir tane bir yerden daha atlayacak. Hani demiş ki belki dağın başına inerim, dağdan bir daha atlarım falan.
Evidently, he'd brought the ransom and briefcase along with him. In interviews conducted on the night of the hijacking, Cooper was described by the crew and passengers as a white male
Beyaz
with
tenli,
brown eyes
kahverengi
and
kaşlı,
dark hair.
koyu saçlı.
He appeared to be in his mid-40s and wore a dark trench coat, a dark suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and dark shoes.
Tam takım geziyor adam ha.
Soon after boarding, he'd also donned a pair of sunglasses.
Pala amına koyayım.
Based on this description, the FBI produced the first of several composite sketches. Before they could mount a search, however, the FBI had to figure out when Cooper abandoned ship. But that was easier said than done. None of the 4 crew members witnessed Cooper jumping from the plane, nor did the pilots of 2 fighter jets which escorted the flight between Seattle and Reno.
Jetler takip ediyor. Jet de mi görmüyor adamı? Oğlum bu adam o zaman kesin eski asker gibi böyle bir özel görev yapmış bir adam. Çok bilgili demek ki. Tam böyle onların göremeyeceği noktayı hesaplayıp atlamış.
Which is not all too surprising given it was the middle of the night.
Gecenin ortası bir de.
Although the flight crew did report something odd. The last communication with the hijacker occurred at approximately 8:05 p.m. when the crew used the intercom to offer assistance, which Cooper declined. Within the next 10 minutes, the crew experienced what they described as an
Aydemir, teşekkürler.
oscillation or vibration of the aircraft. At the time, the crew suspected it might have been produced by Cooper's jump, and a
Atladığı zaman orada o merdiven sallanır mallanır.
subsequent recreation of the hijacking supported that conclusion. Okay, so that took care of the when, but what about the where? While Cooper was very explicit about the flight's configuration and destination, he never specified any kind of route. In fact, Cooper grew so impatient with the slow refueling in Seattle that he dismissed the captain's request to file a flight plan and simply told him to, quote, get the show on the road. As such, the captain chose to fly along an airway known as Victor 23 without any input from Cooper.
Yani şöyle bir mevzu var burada arkadaşlar. Adam atlayacağı yeri neye göre belirledi? Yani ineceği yerde hazır mı, değil mi? Rastgele mi atlıyor? Bir rotası var mı? Onu keşfetmeye
By
çalışıyorlar.
using Victor 23 as a guide, authorities estimated the most probable location of the flight at the approximated time of the jump was about 40 kilometers north of Portland.
Şimdi oraya bir çember.
At the break of dawn, the FBI mounted an impressive search operation using helicopters, airplanes, and ground troops.
Buluyorlar mı?
The problem was, even if the estimated bailout point was accurate, Cooper's eventual landing or drop zone was far more difficult to pinpoint.
Tabii oğlum, nereden bilecek? Adam belki ileriye doğru atladı, oradan sola doğru ani bir dönüş. Bir de o bilgiliyse o var ya, bir süzülmüştür havada.
The loosely defined search area covered a vast stretch of mountainous wilderness occluded by a dense forest, so it was truly like finding a needle in a haystack. Apart from the difficult terrain, the search was further complicated by low temperatures and inclement weather, which persisted for days.
Adam çok iyi hesaplamış bunları. Bir de ben size bir şey diyeyim mi? Belki ikinci paraşütü de yoldayken açıp bir yere bırakmış olabilir. Hani sanki oraya inmiş gibi. Ondan sonra ince paraşütü toplayıp çantasına koyup vın. Ben de düşünebiliyorum böyle şeyler. Ha, asker mi olsam?
Despite their best efforts, authorities never managed to find a single trace of Cooper, nor the items he'd brought along with him.
Adama bak uzadı. Kimleri öldürecek şimdi? Ha, kimseyi öldürmüyor da. Verdikleri paraları tabi banknotları kayıtlı.
Made little to no progress by early December, the FBI turned their attention to the $200,000 ransom. The money had been collected from the Seattle First National Bank, which maintained a ransom package of $250,000 just for such an occasion. Because of this, the serial numbers of the $10,020 banknotes given to Cooper had been documented in advance.
Tamam, şimdi burada o zaman adam resmi yerlerde hiçbir şekilde bu parayı harcayamaz. Direkt dakikasında çökerler bu adama.
A complete list of which were quickly made available to financial institutions, government agencies, and the general public. The intention was to make it as difficult as possible for Cooper to spend his money. Northwest Airlines and several newspapers even began to offer rewards to anyone who could find a note with a matching serial number. In spite of these efforts, no one ever did. That is until nearly a decade later.
10 yıl kaçmış ya adam.
In early 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was building a campfire on a small beach in southern Washington. As he was digging into the sand, Ingram discovered 3 bundles of cash totaling $5,880. Having heard about the infamous skyjacking, Ingram's parents brought the severely degraded bundles to the FBI. The notes were promptly inspected, and sure enough, the serial numbers matched those of the ransom. Once the excitement subsided, however, the money managed to raise far more questions than it answered.
Adam nerede indi, nerede çıktı para, değil mi?
Most significant of which was how? How did the money end up so far away from the drop zone? Looking at this map, it might be tempting to think that Cooper simply dropped some of the money, which then fell into the Lewis River. The bundles could then have been carried further downstream by the Columbia River before finally being washed ashore at Tina Bar, which is the name of the
Ölme
beach.
babam ölme.
Tina Mucklow, Tina Bar. Coincidence? Yeah, coincidence. Anyway, the problem...
Ulan ben dedim ne alaka, ortaklar mıymış?
Tina Bar. Coincidence? Yeah, coincidence.
Ulan kafada kurduydum tam.
Anyway, the problem with this idea is that the Columbia River flows in the opposite direction. This has led some, including members of the FBI, to re-evaluate the initial drop zone assessment. For instance, if the drop zone was much further southeast, close to a river called the Washougal River, it is conceivable, albeit improbable, that the money floated all the way down to Tina Bar.
Kendi de gömmüş olabilir bu arada yani.
Alternatively, the bundles may have simply landed on the beach if the flight path was further to the west. Even so, natural explanations struggle to explain how 3 independent, potentially free-falling and/or free-floating bundles of cash ended up at the exact same place on the same beach.
Gömmüş işte abi, gömmüş.
To complicate matters, sediment from the riverbed was excavated and dumped onto Tina Bar as part of a dredging operation in 1974. And according to one analysis, the money was discovered above this layer of sediment. If true, that would mean the money came to rest at Tina Bar sometime after 1974. But a re-examination of that analysis found that what was believed to be a layer of deposited sediment might actually have been a perfectly natural layer of clay. Not only that, but the sediment was clearly dumped some distance away from where the money was discovered. Furthermore, when Ingram discovered the bundles, the rubber bands which held them together were still intact. This is significant because experiments conducted in 2009 revealed that this brand of rubber bands could not withstand exposure to open air or water for more than a year.
Hadi bakalım, ortalık karıştı.
So, unless the bundles were somehow protected from the elements, they must have become buried at Tina Bar within a year of the hijacking. The most probable explanation, therefore...
O böyle şeyler de çok eğlenceli değil mi yani? FBI ajanı mesela orada diyor ki ya bu lastikler en son şu dönemde üretildi. Bunlar abi sudan geldiyse yıpranma şeyini hesaplayalım arkadaşlar. Onları yapalım, bunları yapalım. Çok güzel aslında meslek ya.
Seems to be that Cooper or someone else deliberately buried the money. Did Cooper survive and bury the money himself? Did someone else bury the money after stumbling upon Cooper's
Bilemeyiz
remains?
orasını artık.
If there is an explanation which does not require human intervention, it's managed to elude investigators for decades. Suffice it to say, this is a mystery within a mystery. Since Ingram's discovery in 1980, both Tina Bar and the grounds around the Washougal River have been subjected to numerous searches, but to date, there's been no sign of Cooper nor the rest of the money.
Tamam baba bu adam kaçmış, ben size söyleyeyim mi? Kaçmış. Kaçtıktan sonra da yalandan ne olur ne olmaz hani yarın bir gün bana bir şey olursa diye oraya bir safe para koymuş. Hani bir şey olursa yarın bir gün gider alırım demiş. Bence o gömmüş yani, başkası değildir.
From the
Müzik ne
very
güzelmiş lan.
beginning, it was assumed by many that Cooper did not survive his daring escape.
Kaçmıştır baba.
It would not make for a very thrilling conclusion to this story, but that's the thing about stories. They're usually far more exciting than reality.
Evet.
While there is no hard evidence for nor against Cooper's survival, the assumption that he fell to his death is not without merit. When Cooper leaped into the darkness, Flight 305 was plowing through a frigid rainstorm at roughly 170 knots, 10,000 feet above southern Washington.
Sıkıntı.
The wind was so violent that it ripped out a placard from the aft stairway, which was later recovered in 1978 almost directly below the estimated flight path. To say that Cooper was not dressed for the occasion would be an understatement. The ground beneath him, meanwhile, was obscured by multiple layers of clouds, which likely means that Cooper jumped without knowing his precise location.
Çok tecrübeli biri olması lazım. Aşırı tecrübeli biri olması lazım.
Even if he could see the ground and had a specific drop zone in mind, the parachute he selected was non-steerable, meaning he would not have been able to steer his descent towards a
Rastgele
specific landing
yalpalaya
spot,
yalpalaya.
thus precluding any potential coordination with an accomplice stationed on the ground. While Cooper expressed some familiarity with parachutes, his actual competence level is up for debate. It's widely believed that Cooper demanded 2 pairs of parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve, to make the authorities believe that he intended to take a hostage. That is precisely what happened, as the FBI contemplated but eventually decided against sabotaging the chutes, as they did not want to risk the life of an innocent civilian. But in their haste to obtain them, they unintentionally provided Cooper with a non-functional dummy chute intended for training purposes.
Ayda.
This mishap seems to have gone unnoticed by Cooper because that dummy chute was one of the 2 missing from the plane.
Ayda. %50.
Not only that, but Cooper chose the older and technically inferior parachute out of the 2 primary chutes provided. So in both cases, it seems like Cooper made the worst possible choice. But there are other ways to interpret this information.
Belki de gizli bir paraşütü vardı.
For instance, it's possible that Cooper used the dummy chute not as a reserve, but as a means to secure the bag of money. In fact, that is precisely what Cooper tried to do with the functional reserve chute. First, he tried to place the money in the chute's canopy before removing some of the suspension lines and wrap them around the bag. Perhaps he used the dummy chute for a similar purpose.
Olabilir.
And Cooper's decision to use the older primary chute is not necessarily an indication of inexperience.
Belki de o paraşüte hakimdir adam işte.
It could also be a sign of familiarity because the chute he left behind was a civilian luxury chute,
Askeri değil mi bu?
while the one he used was a military chute. The argument is
Baba bu adama hiçbir bok olmamıştır. Siz beni dinleyin.
that Cooper might have been trained as, say, a paratrooper and chose the older military chute because that's the one with which he was most familiar. And there is at least one other reason to suspect that Cooper had a military
Adamın ama kimliğine daha hakim değiller mi?
background. While the flight was in a holding pattern near Seattle, Cooper mentioned that the McCord Air Force Base was only 20 minutes away from the Seattle-Tacoma airport. At the time, that was an accurate assessment and might suggest a military background. Apart from the potential military connections, Cooper may even have had links to the Central Intelligence Agency.
Pala diyorum oğlum size, pala.
You see, the type of aircraft which Cooper chose to hijack, a Boeing 727, was also used by the CIA to covertly drop agents and supplies during the Vietnam War.
Oh.
A task for which the Boeing 727 was uniquely qualified due to its distinctive aft stairway.
Bak. Bu adam bunu yapmış oğlum önceden o zaman işte. Eski asker.
It's fairly safe to assume that Cooper chose to hijack a Boeing 727 specifically because it provided a relatively safe means of escape. Whether he learned of this from the CIA or came to that conclusion independently is another question. However, the fact that Cooper chose to hijack a flight operated by Northwest Airlines was apparently random chance. When Tina Mucklow asked Cooper about his motives, he responded, "It's not because I have a grudge towards your airline, it's just because I have a grudge." He further clarified that Flight 305 just happened to be in the right place at the right time.
Tamam, bu adamın bir amacı var yani.
Even so, it's clear that Cooper came prepared. He seemed to know a great deal about aircraft and aviation. He appeared to be familiar with the local terrain. He maintained a low profile to avoid a panic. He covered his eyes with a pair of glasses to conceal his identity. He left very little evidence behind, and he demanded 4 parachutes to force the assumption that he was taking a hostage.
Tam bir profesyonel işi.
He was even cunning enough to reclaim the note which he'd initially given to Florence Schaffner.
Tabii orada yazı kimliğinden.
Apart from the name he wrote on his plane ticket, there are no other samples of Cooper's handwriting. But for all his planning and cunning, it seems Cooper did not give enough thought to his eventual escape. Not only did he fail to specify a route, but he was forced to make a last-minute destination change from Mexico City to Reno.
Bilemeyiz. Belki de yalandan öyle yaptı. Anladın mı? Kafa karışıklığı için. Hani acemi gözükmek için.
He could have demanded more appropriate parachuting equipment like a pair of boots, a helmet, or jumpsuit. He could even have specified the ransom to be delivered in larger denominations to make it lighter and less cumbersome to carry. Presuming he did
Keşke ben de anlayabilsem. Niye anlayamıyorsun ya?
survive the fall and made it safely to the ground, he may then have had to make his way through a dense, partially snow-covered forest in nothing but loafers and a trench coat in late November. I get the distinct impression that Cooper's escape was much more of a leap of faith than a carefully executed jump. On the other hand, authorities never received a missing persons report matching the description of Cooper in the wake of the hijacking. This
Belki de kimi kimsesi yok. İngilizcem yok abi. Kardeşim Türkçen yok mu? Altyazı var ya.
might suggest that Cooper did survive and that he swiftly and quietly resumed his normal routine. Furthermore, other hijackers have performed similar stunts, and many of them did survive even if they were quickly apprehended. Finally, the simplest explanation for how 3 bundles of cash ended up at Tina Bar is human intervention. At the end of the day, most of this is based on nothing but supposition, without any concrete
Yani bu adam ölmüş olsa, şimdi şöyle düşüneceğim. Bu adam ölmüş olsa o paraya biri çöker, harcar ve yakalanır. O da olmuyor bak.
evidence of Cooper's demise. It leaves the door wide open to the far more exciting proposition that he did, in fact, survive.
Ha, şüpheliler.
By the time the press got wind of the hijacking, the FBI had already begun to investigate a few potential suspects. Among them was a man in Portland with initials DB and surname Cooper. This Cooper was quickly eliminated as a suspect, but due to a mix-up by the press, the name Dan Cooper was confused for DB Cooper, and the rest is history. While Dan Cooper is most likely a pseudonym, there is a comic book series of the same name. The comic is written in French and centers around a Canadian pilot named Dan Cooper. While the
Aha, bak. Ali Koper. Abonelik hediye etmiş. Umut abonelik hediye etmiş. Eyvallah.
comic was not translated into English nor sold in the United States before 1971, it was available in Canada, which has a large French-speaking population. Given that American and Canadian accents can be difficult to distinguish, it's possible that Cooper, who was described as having no discernible accent, was a bilingual Canadian. This might even be supported by something that Cooper might have said. You see, when the captain relayed Cooper's demands to air traffic control, he used the phrase negotiable American currency. It seems doubtful that an American citizen would specify American currency, so perhaps Cooper was not American. The problem is we don't know if this is a direct quote from Cooper or paraphrasing by the captain.
Tamam, o detayı kaptan da hatırlayamaz ki.
For instance, notes taken by the crew during the hijacking merely contain the phrase negotiable currency, while testimonies provided by the crew after the hijacking include phrases like $200,000 in cash and circulated US currency. So Cooper might have been Canadian, and he might have taken his name from the Dan Cooper comics, just as he might have been American and
Ali
might have
Cooper,
taken his
eyvallah.
name from something or someone else. Nearly half a century has gone by since the hijacking took place, and in that time thousands of suspects have been
Lan
questioned
bulunamadı adam.
and investigated. It would obviously be impossible to cover all of them here, but let's take a look at some of the people that at some point or another have been suspected of being D.B. Cooper. Robert Rackstraw first became a suspect in 1978, and on the surface he seems like a solid candidate.
Evet, tipi benziyor.
He was a decorated army paratrooper and helicopter pilot. He had experience with explosives. He had an extensive criminal record. He had an uncle named John Cooper who was an avid skydiver.
Bak.
He was expelled from the army only months before the hijacking, which might suggest a motive. After all, the hijacker did say he
Bir sıkıntım var demişti adam.
had a grudge. When confronted by journalists and private investigators, Rackstraw would neither confirm nor outright deny that he was D.B. Cooper. Instead, he'd say things like, "I could have been," or "I would not discount myself." On the other hand, Rackstraw had light-colored eyes, which Cooper did not. More significantly, Rackstraw was only 28 years of age at the time of the hijacking.
Ve orada 40 yaş üstü diyorlardı değil mi?
This is well outside the range of ages reported by the crew and passengers, most of whom believed Cooper was in his mid-40s.
Ya Lens de yaşı tutmuyor ki.
Kenneth Christensen first became a suspect in 2003 when his brother noticed certain parallels between him and Cooper. Christensen had briefly served as a paratrooper in World War II, and since 1953 he'd worked for Northwest Airlines as both a mechanic and a flight attendant. He was 45 years old at the time of the hijacking.
uyuyor bu
He
adam.
was left-handed, which Cooper might have been. For instance, Cooper used his left hand to interact with his briefcase, and the clip-on tie he left on board was affixed with a tie clasp applied from the left. Shortly before he died in 1994, Christensen had supposedly told his brother, "There is something you should know, but I cannot tell you."
Hayda.
After his passing, his family discovered over $200,000 in his bank accounts.
Ama $5.000. $5.000.
To top it all off, Florence Schaffner stated that photographs of Christensen bore a strong resemblance to Cooper.
Rodyak
On the
abone
other
olmuş, hoş
hand,
geldin.
Christensen did not match the physical description of Cooper. He was both shorter and lighter. While Schaffner did see a strong resemblance, she remarked that Cooper had more hair, and that is supported by the composite sketches.
Kim acaba adam? Çok merak ettim lan.
And there was nothing suspicious about the large sums of money which he'd simply earned by selling land.
Tamam, şüpheli değil bir adamdı o zaman.
Richard McCoy first became a suspect in 1972
Bu adam değildir ya. Bu adam sanki direkt yakalanacak bir tip çizdi bende.
when he hijacked a Boeing 727 and escaped via the
Ama çok da benziyor. Kepçe kulaktan yakalarlardı ama ya. Kepçe kulak derlerdi yani.
aft stairway, much like D.B. Cooper. Because of the significant overlap between the two hijackings, some believe they must have been committed by the same person. McCoy used a fake name, he used a fake hand grenade to threaten the crew, he used handwritten notes to issue his demands.
Özenmiştir belki.
Both McCoy and Cooper used the phrase "no funny stuff" as a warning to the crew. McCoy demanded $500,000 in cash and 4 parachutes.
Özenmiş gibi.
McCoy also bailed out the back of the plane once they passed over his hometown in the state of Utah. Apart from the similar modus operandi, McCoy had also served in the Vietnam War as a demolitions expert and a helicopter pilot. McCoy did actually survive the fall and managed to evade authorities for 2 full days before he was apprehended and sentenced to 45 years in prison.
2 günde kaçabilmiş ha.
Before his death in 1974, McCoy refused to confirm or deny that he was D.B. Cooper. On the other hand, McCoy was an avid recreational skydiver and even came prepared with a skydiving helmet and jumpsuit. He gave very specific instructions about the flight path, In addition to the fake hand grenade, McCoy also used an unloaded handgun to threaten the crew. He failed to retrieve one of the notes he'd given to a flight attendant.
Tamam bu değil.
He was only 29 years of age at the time of the hijacking, and all 3 flight attendants were quite certain that McCoy was not Cooper. While there are meaningful parallels between these two cases, McCoy might simply have been a copycat who'd read about DB
Bence
Cooper
de bu adam taklitçi.
in the news. Dwayne Webber first became a suspect in 1995 when, shortly before his death, he supposedly told his wife, "I've got a secret to tell you. I am Dan Cooper."
Bu da yalan gibi.
Following his deathbed confession, Webber's widow recalled a number of fascinating details. She claims to have found a bank bag resembling the one used in the hijacking.
Hayda.
She claims Webber had sustained a knee injury after jumping out of a plane. Webber supposedly had a nightmare about leaving his fingerprints on the aft stairs. And a year before the money was discovered at Tina Bar, Webber had allegedly paid a quick visit to the same location.
Hayda.
In addition, Webber was a World War II veteran, he had an extensive criminal record, he'd matched the physical description, and he was 47 years old in 1971.
Bak bu adam olabilirmiş.
On the other hand, Webber's fingerprints did not match any of the prints collected from Flight 305. Although, to be fair, there's no way to know if any of those prints actually belonged to Cooper.
Belki hiçbir yere parmak izi bırakmadı adam.
Furthermore, Webber's DNA did not match a DNA sample collected from the tie clasp. But once again, there's no way to know if the DNA on the tie clasp actually came from the hijacker and not someone
O da
else.
bilinemez.
What's so frustrating is that the FBI likely had a much better source of DNA at one point. If you recall, 8 cigarette butts were collected from the scene, and there's a good chance they were all suffused with Cooper's DNA. The problem is, that evidence was lost at some point, and has not turned up since.
Hayda, derin devlet mevzuları var burada oğlum. Kaybedilmiş.
William Smith first became a suspect in 2018.
Bu adam aynısı lan. Birebir.
Smith served in the Navy during World War II and likely had some experience with parachuting. He was 43 years old at the time of the hijacking, he had dark brown eyes, he matched the physical description, he shared a certain likeness with the composite sketches,
Bayağı benziyor oğlum.
especially this speculative sketch of an older DB Cooper. A student named Ira Daniel Cooper, who was killed in World War II, attended the same high school as Smith. Smith worked as a yardmaster for a railroad company for most of his life, but in 1970 the company filed for bankruptcy. As a consequence, Smith lost his pension, which might suggest a motive. He could, for instance, have developed a grudge towards the airline industry for their role in bringing about the downfall of the rail transportation industry. It's further speculated that Smith could have used his knowledge of railroad networks to hop on a train and escape undetected.
Bak.
On the other hand, Smith spent his entire life in the northeastern United States, given that the hijacking occurred on the other side of the country and was committed by someone who at least appeared to be familiar with the
Burada mırtlamış mırt.
local terrain, Smith is not the most ideal candidate. However, the fact that Smith worked as a yardmaster is interesting. You see, the tie that Cooper left behind was recently examined using an electron microscope, which uncovered various metallic particles. Some of these particles, especially pure titanium, were quite rare in 1971. This might suggest that Cooper worked as a manager at some sort of chemical or metallurgical facility, or possibly a rail yard.
Ya her şey bir varsayım, hiçbir şekilde bulamamışlar yani.
If nothing else, I hope this limited selection of suspects illustrates just how difficult it is to be certain when you have so little evidence to work with. These 5 individuals look nothing alike, yet any one of them could be DB Cooper.
Hepsinin ama bir harbiden hepsi DB Cooper'a benziyor ama birbirine de benzemiyor ha. Bir tek şu ikisi biraz birbirine benziyor.
Was Cooper really in his mid-40s, or did he simply look old for his age? Did Cooper really serve in the military? Which one of these sketches most closely resemble Cooper? In 2016, the FBI had to admit defeat and officially close down the case. Unless someone stumbles upon Cooper's remains or manages to track down the rest of the money, it seems there is little hope of resolution. Did Cooper survive? I have no idea.
Bence
But as long as
kurtuldu.
that possibility cannot be dismissed, the legend of D.B. Cooper will no doubt persist.